But I think where we really have to change our attitude and change policy, it isn't a budgetary matter. We have to change our policy and attitude about entitlements. We have to change our attitude about our foreign policy. And this is why I say that the amount of money that we spend on our militarism around the world has to be questioned. And I also argue the case that we will have a stronger national defense if we do less overseas and start bringing our troops home and take care of ourselves here in this country. We're actually engaged in 6 military operations around the world. When you start adding up Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Somalia and now in Libya. But right now, even in Libya, it is done so carelessly and casually. The president doesn't even come to the Congress anymore. Doesn't get even an announcement or some token approval. I'm pretty old-fashioned on this. I think if any president that ever wants to go to war, he ought to go to the Congress and to the people and say, look, our security is threatened. If we need to go to war, we ought to declare the war and fight it and get it over with instead of allowing our presidents to go to war at will. That's what we have to stop. And the other thing, the way we go to war, not only does the president ignore the Congress, the proper procedures here, we go to war under the auspices of NATO and the United Nations. I mean, that is not the way it was meant to be. The founders advised us, stay out of entangling alliances. That to me is an entangling alliance, and we shouldn't be doing it that way. And I actually have taken the position for many, many years that we'd be a lot better off if we weren't even in the United Nations. The largest amount of any nation, but we don't get more votes. You know, they can gang up on us when they want to, but we have to pay all the bills. But the issue of the foreign policy and engagement, the military engagement, that's where a lot of money is being spent. They say the budget is like $600 billion, $700 billion for the military, but when you add up everything else, what the CIA does in the State Department and all these other things, it's about $1.3 trillion. So it is big. But I separate the two ideas of defense spending. Everything is DOD, defense spending. You can't cut defense because then you're un-American, you don't like the troops, and you know, you're not patriotic. So you can't cut defense. But I don't want to cut defense, but I do want to cut the military, because a lot of the military is what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Build weapons for the sake of weapons, that have arms profiteering and this sort of thing. So that we do not need. Now, I have argued the case, and I've been challenged about, you know, being less than supportive of the troops. I happen to know a little bit about the troops because I was one of them for about 5 years in a very tough period in our history during the 1960s. But the one thing that indicates to me that the troops do not find my position offensive in any way. Because if you look at the donations coming from active military personnel, I get more donations than all the other candidates put together. That should tell us something, that they're not as anxious to go to war as some people think. And I got to thinking, well, that's exactly the way it was in 1965 when they were escalating in Vietnam. And I thought, well, you know, I was in between active duty and going into the reserves, and I was in my medical training. I'll tell you what, I was not very happy when they were escalating at that time. So, but think of our troops, what they've been through, the guard units and the reservists, and how many trips they've made over there, and the buddies that they use, and the casualties. We've lost 8,500 Americans already, 40,000 severe injuries, hundreds of thousands now applying for veterans benefits. This is going to go on for decades and decades, and it's not going to stop. Matter of fact, it's being expanded. They're talking about going into 2 more countries. There are people now willing to say that maybe the Iranians might be a military power someday in the future, so we got to go to war against them now. I don't think that makes any sense whatsoever. We ought to change our foreign policy. We ought to have a strong national defense. We ought to defend our Constitution, and we ought to mind our own business.
Yeah.
And we'll all be back.